is doing and what's happening across the province, and hopefully in a hopeful way talk about some of the solutions. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tony Stortz.
I want to thank John for putting this together, all the volunteers at Waterloo Lutheran and the Center for Public Ethics for making this happen. And looking out at the room today, when John asked me to do this, I was thinking, okay, great, 2 speaking gigs back to back. I can reuse the same material. But seeing that about 50% of the folks here were also here last night, I'll assure you I wrote something new. And so I'll have something different to keep you busy for the next little bit. And in the spirit of public ethics, I want to start our time together today by coming clean on something. In the planning of this event, I lied to John Malloy. When he asked if I would speak today, I was thrilled. I was really excited to say yes. And we agreed, faith, homelessness, and faith communities' roles in finding a solution for the homelessness crisis. Now, at the risk of never being invited back, I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff today. In our time together, I'm not going to tell you about homelessness because seeing the faces in this room, you already know. I'm not going to tell you about faith because seeing the faces in this room, you know much more about it than I do. I'm not going to recite numbers. I'm not going to go into how wrong or how expensive or how inhumane it is. And I'm not going to tell you how we end it because, to be honest, I really have no idea. Instead of this, I want to take the time today and describe a building to you. And the challenge I want to put forward to you as the people in this room is to figure out how to build it. This building's called the Museum of Homelessness, and I believe it should be built right here in Waterloo Region. So starting, I want to say, why a museum? Surely there's other buildings we should be building here. There's other things we need to focus on. We need to focus on housing. We need to focus on healthcare. We need to focus on these other things. But in our society, a museum is a symbol. A museum means that we overcame a problem, that we made right something that was very wrong. And when we do that, when we overcome something, we build a museum. It's our way of saying that there was an injustice. And through our collective effort, we put that injustice in the past. It's our way of saying never again. And it's a place where we send our children and our grandchildren on school trips so they can see the way things used to be, and they can see how far we've come, and they can make sure that our future is going to be better than our past. And all across the world, this is what museums do. There's the Holocaust Museum, where we remember the evils of genocide and the systematic murders. There's the D-Day museums and the Museum of the Resistance, where we learn about the generation who sacrificed so much to scrub that evil from the world. There's the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg. There's the Museum of Slavery in Washington, D.C. I can go on and on and on. But whenever we overcome something huge in our society, we build a museum as a cathedral to our success. So again, with our time here today, I want to plant the seed of a new museum, and I'll take you on a little tour of what it can look like. And then I want you guys, the people in this room, to help us build it. And so if you'll indulge me for a little bit, I want to take you on a tour of the Museum of Homelessness. And that tour starts with the drive that we're going to take to get there. This is a drive through Waterloo Region after homelessness. And the drive starts coming up Victoria Street from Guelph. And as you go and you hit the red lights where the motels are, you realize that there's no one panning for change at the intersections. There's no one looking for small coins or bills that will help them get through another day and secure their necessities of life. And you keep driving up Victoria and you turn left, but you hit a red light at Weber Vic. And you see that in that little plot of land, there's no tarps, there's no tents, there's no one huddled over against the cold. It's just an empty piece of land that the region still insists they're going to build on someday. And the light turns and you turn left and you see that there's nobody waiting at St. John's Kitchen. The working center's repurposed it to train people to be chefs. And there's nobody in that alleyway waiting for a place to get warm or a cup of coffee. And as you keep driving, you notice that you also haven't seen any temporary fencing in the community. You know those artificial walls that we put up to keep desperate people out of vacant land? They're gone because nobody's trying to find shelter there. You keep driving down Weber Street, and on the right you see St. Mary's Parish. And while the church looks the same, there's something different. That little white house in front, tiny home takeout, it's gone. You know, Chef Amy and her team kept working away, but eventually people just stopped coming. And they got rid of the house, and now the church is a vibrant community on Sundays, but it isn't serving frontline outreach purposes. Then you take a right? You take a right on Ottawa, up to Homer Watson and down Ardelt Place. And you see that on the front lawn of the school board and on that city road allowance, a Better Tent City's gone too. And if you know what to look for, you can see the scars in the land where the electrical lines were buried and all the plumbing infrastructure was put in and then taken out. But if you didn't know what to look for, or if the snow was down, you would never know it was there. And like she promised, Nadine Green was the last person to leave a Better Tent City. But she left because they couldn't fill the houses anymore. They were too small and nobody needed them. And from there you get on Homer Watson and onto the expressway, and you drive up to North Waterloo and up Lobsinger Line, and then just outside of Cross Hill, you see it. That's where we built the Museum of Homelessness. Now, if you'll stay with me on this little tour, it continues inside. And when you go into the Museum of Homelessness, there's a series of exhibits laid out one after another that tell us the story of how we got here. There's the Hall of Rising Rents, where you can walk through the quality of apartments that we allowed people on disability to live in. You can walk through what they could afford in 1994 and 2000, in 2010 and 2015. You can see how with the pandemic it got smaller, and there are more and more roommates and issues in these, until by the end, it's just a tarp. And they're laid out like an IKEA kitchen, where you can go in and you can see it and you can sit on the bed, and then you can walk forward in time and see how it gets smaller and harder to live in legislated poverty in our community. There's an exhibit on the origins of opioids, where we learn about how pharmaceutical companies lied about these drugs not being addictive, and they flooded the market with them, and all of a sudden they cut them off and let the street drug supply and fentanyl take over. There's a room off to the side on the rise and fall of harm reduction, where healthcare workers and activists did their best to protect people from that wave of opioid poisonings, and they tried to keep people alive and safe, and they worked their career to make it happen, just for a turn of government to take it all away. There's an exhibit on the toxic drugs, where you can see through a magnifying glass the amount of fentanyl it would take to kill you, and you can learn about the effects of methamphetamine and benzodiazepine and xylazine and all these chemical names that have become far too familiar for those of us who work in the outreach industry. There's an exhibit on the experiences of women on the street and the unbelievable threats to their safety and the compromises and trade-offs they have to make to stay well. And there's a room on tents and tarps where you can explore how people with nowhere to go and no resources built shelters, found resources, found heating fuel. And you can see the way that they had to hide themselves because their determination to survive at all costs made them criminals and brought our law enforcement out to find them. And in this exhibit, once an hour, a big fan turns on and a storm comes, and you can go into the tent and you can hear how loud it is when the tarp rattles against the wind, and try to imagine how anybody slept through the night on a night like the ones we've had. And finally, an exhibit on street pets, where the dogs and other companion animals who never left their owner's side as everything else in their life fell apart are honored for their loyalty, and their owners are honored for the fact that they provided food and care and warmth to their dogs, even when they couldn't provide it to themselves. But as you go through exhibit after exhibit, you realize that the floor you're walking on is tilting slightly down. And this building, which looked so small from the outside, this problem which, from the street, you noticed it, but you didn't really see it. It's entrenched deep into the ground. And every step you take through this exhibit, everything that you learn, every move you make pulls you deeper and deeper and deeper into this homelessness until you feel like you've gone so far down that there's an impossible distance between you and the sun, and like there's no way back out. But then, all of a sudden, at the bottom, the floor levels out, and you realize you've reached the end. And at the bottom of the Museum of Homelessness, there is a room. There's a round stone room, like being at the bottom of a giant well, with gray walls that stretch up and up and up and up. And the walls stretch so high that the top of this room actually reaches above ground. And there's a skylight up there that, although you're so far down, fills the room with a warm light. And on closer inspection, you can see that the walls of this room have names carved into them. Corey and Chris, Kaylee and Ken. This room is a memorial, and the walls hold the names of everyone who died from addictions and homelessness in our community. They hold the names of everyone who died from cold in a community with so much warmth, and they hold the names of everyone who died alone in a community with so much connection. And when you look, maybe the name of someone you know is on that wall. Maybe it's the name of somebody that you loved. And in this room, in this memorial, you can run your fingers on their name carved into the stone. You can remember their life in its complicated beauty, and you can remember that we failed them, that they died from a problem that never should have been. And so many people who die from homelessness never get a proper burial. They never have a place to be remembered. And so this cathedral at the base of the Museum of Homelessness is their final resting place. But like any memorial, you can only sit there for so long. And on the other side of this round room, there is a door. And when you walk through that door, there's a path. And while every other exhibit in this museum has had the floor tilting down, the path on this other side tilts up. It's so slight at first that you barely notice, but as you keep walking, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And then you notice that on the walls of this rising road, there are plaques. And these plaques don't show investments or statistics or numbers. Instead, they hold the names of the names and the stories of people who never gave up. These plaques honor the people who ended homelessness, and they honor the people who built this museum in our community. So in my hallway, there's a plaque for Father Toby Collins, who took St. Mary's Parish and made it into a place that lived the gospel. In my hallway, there's a plaque for Stephanie and Joe Mancini, whose courage formed the moral backbone of our community in the decades that we wrestled with this problem. In my hallway, there's a path for Pete McKechnie, the outreach worker from Sanguine who, although he's a drummer, always carries guitar strings with him because he knows that healthcare and housing is not all that makes a life complete. People need beauty too. And there's a plaque for Paul Motes and the Motes family who step up when no one else will and fill the gaps to make sure that good things keep happening in Waterloo Region. There's plaques for Nadine Green, for Chef Amy, for Jisoo Park, for Anna Kalgis. I can go on and on and on. But that's just my wall. And I'm going to ask a question of the people in the room, which is, who's on your wall? When you look at the rising road out of the Museum of Homelessness, when you see the names of the people who ended this, who said that this isn't right, that we can't keep doing it, who refused to accept that homelessness and addictions and deep poverty were inevitable in a community with so much, who are those names? And so, if you'll indulge me for one last time, I'm going to pause this talk so that you can write their plaques. In the middle of your table, there are Post-its, or there are cue cards and pens. I'd like you to grab one, please. And as you do, I'll ask you to put down maybe 3 or 4 names of people who for you are the ones that built this. and if you can, maybe a few words about why. I'll give you a minute. All right, I'm starting to see pens go down, and I want to respect the timelines here. But I'm wondering if anyone in this room is willing to share, nothing stories, but just the name of somebody that you put on that list. And please put up your hand if you're willing to share one name off your list. Yeah.
2 names?
Yeah, go for 2. Yeah, and just project them.
Laura Hamilton.
Laura Hamilton, yeah.
Esther Bean.
Esther Bean, absolutely. Yeah. Any other names anyone wants to share?
House of Friendship.
House of Friendship, yeah.
John Neufeld.
John Neufeld, absolutely.
John Lawley.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ken.
Kim Decker, Cambridge White University.
Kim Decker, yeah.
Sybil Burnett.
Sybil Burnett, absolutely. And so I opened this little talk with a confession about lying to John, and I'll close it with one too. The reality is, even though I'm in front of the room today, I have no idea how we build this museum. The problem is big and deep, and it keeps getting worse. And if I'm being honest, I don't know how we end it. But I do have faith in the people in this room. I believe that the people in this room today, right here, and the names of the people you wrote on those cards have everything that we need to make this happen. I believe that Waterloo Region is the place where we start to build that rising road out of homelessness all across the country. I think this is where we start. And I believe that this museum, that the Museum of Homelessness, will be a real place. That it'll be one that we take our children and our grandchildren to, so they can see the way things used to be. And they can see what we did to make it right in our lifetime. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Better Street is kind of what spun out of the work that we did with A Better Tent City, or that I did at A Better Tent City. And through my time there, I really fell in love with tiny home communities and the idea of innovating in the way that we help people. We've innovated so much in the rest of our society over the last 80 years. The way we communicate has changed, the way we pay bills has changed, the way we travel has changed. But you can look back at still images from the Great Depression and realize that the way we treat people in poverty and the way that we try to solve that hasn't really changed. And so Better Street is an effort to take sort of the idea of innovation and the values of helping people and put it together. And we work across the country to help build tiny home communities, addictions treatment centers, supportive housing, anything that helps people living in homelessness, addictions, and deep poverty. And yeah, we help try to get those projects together and over the finish line so that people have a little bit more of a chance and we can innovate in the way that we help people. Absolutely, yeah, thank you. So for anyone who couldn't hear at the back, the question is, what sort of 3 things can governments do in a very concrete way to sort of help us build this museum? And I mean, there's a bunch, right? Like, for those of us who I was having a chat at the beginning, for those of us who work in getting housing projects actually built, there's a lot of manufactured hurdles that we have to clear, which are, really difficult and onerous. And I found that governments don't treat it like a crisis. And the parallel that I'll draw is when we needed to open vaccine clinics during the pandemic. I don't know if a lot of vaccine clinics had to be held up for 6 to 12 months while we did a sound study on them, or, because we treated that like a crisis because middle-class people and wealthy people were at risk of dying. But when it's poor people and people with addictions who are at risk, all of a sudden there's a lot less urgency. And I think taking that urgency that we had in the pandemic and seeing it as we have a public health crisis, we have something that's putting our people at risk, the default answer is yes, unless we have a reason to say no, instead of the default answer being no. And if you clear this obstacle course of strange burdens, then the answer might be yes, if you're lucky and if you behave. But if you step off the path at all, it's over. And there's no sense of urgency. There's no sense that this is a thing that we really need. The other thing that I would ask politicians for, and this is not a concrete thing, it's more of a soft thing, but it's bravery, right? I think that to be a political leader who backs a project like this requires a deep level of bravery. You have to be willing to do something that may be unpopular. You have to be willing to advocate for a cause. You have to be willing to not run when the mob of people who are scared comes at you. And you have to be willing to educate and talk to people who think differently. And that's not an easy thing to do. So, you know, there's other sort of policy like kinds of fixes in terms of as of right zoning, increasing density, making things more affordable, development charges. Like there is all of that world. But I think all of that stems out of a feeling of urgency that this is a crisis and that people who are in poverty and people who have addictions matter just as much as people who were susceptible during the pandemic. And that we're going to take that level of urgency and we're going to face it with bravery. And I think if you had those two things, all the other barriers would melt. Thanks. Padre.
So we're a smart community. We know this is happening. You mentioned that Paul Motes, the Motes Family Foundation, stepped up when nobody else would. What's wrong with us? Like,
yeah.
What do you think's wrong with us?
Yeah, so again, for anyone in the back, the question was, what's wrong with us? No, it's very fair. Like, I've noticed this trend, this really challenging, kind of disturbing thing over the last 5 or 6 years, which is in 2020, when we were trying to get stuff like this going, broadly there was an understanding that, you know, if we weren't all in the same boat, we were all in the same storm. And that there was an idea that things could get better, and there was an idea that through collective action and care, we could make things happen that otherwise seemed impossible. And the pandemic opened a little break in our public policy world that allowed things like a better tent city and our livable solutions in Kingston to slip through. But since then, and specifically over the last 2 years, it feels like the drawbridge has been pulled up, the moat has been filled with water, and they've added sharks. Like, it's gotten way harder to do anything. And I think what it comes to for me is this idea of fear and the fact that, you know, if I have a neighbor who is different than me, if I have a neighbor who is poorer than me, if I have a neighbor with an issue, mental health, addictions, a physical health or disability problem, that endangers my security. And it's become this idea of the world has become more unstable, our communities have become more unstable, we're more worried about falling off that cliff of homelessness or poverty and into that deep water. And so we pull up the bridge, right? We make it harder for people to build things near us. We find reasons not to do so. And when we do outreach worker training, which we do a lot of, I talk about this idea of radical empathy. And radical empathy is all about who is the person in this room who it's the hardest for me to feel gentle towards, right? And for some people, it's, you know, the pimp or the drug dealer or the sex worker. But like, I have a background in street outreach. For me, those people are cool. I like hanging out with them. They're fun. The person who's hard for me to feel empathy towards is the counselor who's blocking something at a committee. The person who is, you know, a NIMBY, I don't love that word, and yelling at us. But if I can see them through that lens of radical empathy, you know, the counselor is trying to represent their constituents who are afraid and are seeing their security go and want to be in parks and want to have their kids running around barefoot on Victoria Park Island without worrying about needles. And that person who's yelling at us at a meeting may be a senior on a fixed income for whom their house was their retirement savings. And they're living, but inflation has made groceries go up, and they're seeing that security rattled by something that we're trying to bring forward. And so at the base of it all for me is that level of fear, and that fear turning to animosity, and that animosity turning into a zero-sum game where you gaining is me losing. And I think that is the core of like what's wrong with us. And the people who see beyond that, for me, those are the heroes that I mentioned. And I'm sure those are some of the names on your cards as well. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, the idea of these social systems. And I'll do something maybe slightly unpopular and come to the defense of blocking municipal councilors and staff and sort of the elected officials who get kicked a lot, right? And I do feel for them. if you're a counselor who wants to keep their job and 80% of your constituents who vote are really against something, you can be brave and stand up and do all those things, but you know what? You're not going to make it through the next election cycle. So as long as our municipal election turnout is so low, and as long as the people who vote are people who own single-family detached homes, and if that's the system of incentives, of course we're not going to do anything. That is the structure under which we've done it. A lot of these projects, when we try to bring something into a new community, like a Better Tent City, at a city level, everybody loves it. It's at a ward level that it dies and that it really struggles. And that's because of who votes in municipal elections. And we can yell at the councillors all we want, but the reality is if they act against what their constituents want, A, that's not democratic, and B, they just won't be around, and then later we'll have a councillor who is even less sympathetic. So I appreciate that the structures that you mentioned kind of put our elected officials in a bind. And again, like I said, I don't know the answer to it. Yeah. Thank you. That's a very difficult question to answer, but I'll give it my best shot. We're going to fix society here, folks, and then we're going to be here out on time for work. So I'm a huge fan of the author Wendell Berry. And yeah, so yeah. Any working center folks in the room? No? All right, cool. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Wendell Berry, and the idea that he writes a lot about topsoil and erosion. And that, all your high-minded ideals in the world aren't useful if you can't stop the topsoil from washing away. And if you can't grow a long-term sustainable farm that is the underpinning of a society, that is the underpinning, of a family and of a place that looks out for each other in these small communities. And I think at a high level, we've allowed this idea of exploitation and mechanization and growth at all costs to rip apart the other things that held us together, right? Like the messages and the communion of faith communities, the idea of kids going to school with others who aren't like them, and the parents meeting each other at pickups and drop-offs and soccer games. And when I think about it through the lens of Wendell Berry, it's you can't grow a wonderful tree or an orchard on a place with no topsoil. And what I heard in your question is, how do we rebuild the topsoil? And he talks about that too, in that rebuilding topsoil by definition isn't fast. It's every season the leaves coming down and decaying and getting wet and getting snowed on and thawing and doing it again. It's an act of stewardship, it's an act of growth, and it's an act of love. And so I think any answer I give you that isn't measured in decades isn't going to work. But to see our shared communal life as a topsoil that we need to rebuild over time and over generations, I think is the only chance we have at doing that. And yeah, it's true, there's that. The reason why in this I wanted to have people write down the names of people they looked up to who did it in this space is I think there's this insidious form of powerlessness that we feel in the face of something like this. And, my friend Khalil has a great line. He says, "God loves bravery. Why else would he make monkeys with such thin skin?" And he's shockingly smart. We, yeah, I've seen Khalil's on Jeff's card there. And, that's I think what we need to do. We need to see it and break out of this sense of hopelessness and realize, no, we have agency. Everything we need is in the room or on these cards. And it's about, do we step into that challenge or do we step back from that challenge? Do we believe that this is possible? Are we going to show that bravery? Or is this going to be something that we, kick down the road? And I firmly believe that, seeing this group of people and knowing this community well, that it will be one that responds with a lot of bravery.
Thank you. I'm going to have to